because it likes it when I say ridiculous things. Here we are. All right, and I'm gonna also, I'm glad I remembered to do this.
Record.
Record
Recording's good if we're
program. And yeah, the record. Yeah, like it's good if the content is good. If
right, exactly.
content is not good, then it is just as well that we forget to record. Anyway,
You can just delete it,
this is the Solidarity House live stream. We're live on this beautiful Friday. It really is a beautiful day in Laramie, really at a premium. So we won't take up too much of your time here, about an hour, and then you can go outside and play, hopefully. Anyway, we have Dee Austin with Yana Ludwig today, and Derek and Antifa are going to be talking to Yana and Dee about campaigning, running a socialist campaign, a socialist-oriented campaign in Wyoming, and what that's like. And so I'm so thankful to have them on. Before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that this is Solidarity House Cooperative, that you can support us if you like this content on patreon.com/solidarityhouse. And this weekend, in the next few days at least, I don't want to make promises I can't keep, but we are going to be dropping a couple of really, really awesome podcast episodes that you can find also on podbean.com. We're also on Spotify and a bunch of other platforms. And one of the segments of that podcast will be this discussion right here. So you might be listening to it that way, even as you are hearing my voice now. So without further ado, please support us at patreon.com/solidarityhouse. It's great to have Yana and Donatella here. I'm going to turn the time over to Derek and Antifa to ask some questions and have a good conversation about campaigning as a socialist in Wyoming, where I just want to add, Yana won nearly 5,000 votes, came in second in a primary, running a very openly democratic socialist oriented campaign. So lots to say about that. I will leave that to others this morning to talk about. Thanks, everybody.
Well, good morning and welcome. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we sure can.
I don't have a camera on my new computer. I have to get one, but it's great to have you here with the Solidarity House Collective and to talk about what it was like running an openly socialist campaign, openly radical. You live here at Solidarity Collective, Yana, openly trans, radical, queer, friendly, people of color friendly place, not things you often associate with Wyoming. But I'd like to start this off by posing kind of a strange question to you. Why the heck not? If Arizona was able to elect a bisexual person to the Senate, red Arizona, which flipped in the last election to the blue if you are worried about Republican Democratic binary politics, which I kind of loathe. But since that happened in Arizona, I want to pose that question. Obviously that didn't happen until after your election, but did that kind of strike you as a why not? Or did you ever walk into this thinking, wow, this is going to be an experiment in self-flagellation? I mean, or was it more of a let's go, why not this?
I mean, I think both. I mean, there was definitely, I mean, I don't know how you would get to the point of making the choice that I made to run without having a little bit of that, like, why the hell not kind of attitude about it. And I think that it was motivated for me a lot by looking around Wyoming politics and realizing that there really wasn't like a body of people who were not just progressive, because we do have other progressives in the state, but somebody else with like a real power analysis, and it needed to get talked about in Wyoming politics. And so, I think there was that, like 2 years ago was right when I was in the process of like first going like, I think I'm going to do this crazy thing. And I think the thing was like, I was sort of bouncing between like the why me and why not me polls. yeah, so I definitely think that that was part of it. And there have definitely been aspects of it that have felt a little bit like self-flagellation. So yeah, all of the above.
Very good. Dee, if I could talk to you, what out of Yana's many characteristics drew you to her as a candidate at the beginning of all this? Well, what we started last year, last year 19 is when you started the primary was, I don't know exactly when you started campaigning, but
Yeah, it was June 2019 was when we.
okay, so it's
Yeah.
forever. That was a whole year of campaigning. And so, Donatella, what brought you to Yana as a Wyoming candidate for Senate?
Well, what's really interesting about that is that I think my sibling and my mother had actually gone to see Yana speak. I think on the very early part of her campaign trail, they went to Laramie to hear her. And then, so I've just liked her page. Didn't really think much of it. Wasn't really like that involved in the politics on Wyoming because I felt so disappointed a year after year. And then suddenly she had asked if there was a graphic designer. I wasn't doing too much. I was like, okay, I'm going to find out. And I ended up making her bingo card. Walking into the Solidarity Collective, I got a tour, and then suddenly was just like really taken aback by her charisma and how active listening she was and compassionate. And it just took off from there.
Okay. It sounds like Yana exercised one of those key skills that politicians claim to have, which is the ability to listen. So that was a good characteristic and trait that brought you over to Yana's side. I don't want to dominate the conversation, so I want to hand off to Derek and see if he's got a few preliminary questions before we get a little bit deeper into all of this.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to hear kind of a more chronological narrative, but maybe something I'd like to hear both of your perspectives on beforehand is kind of a dichotomy that I've been having in my mind. Maybe it's what you'd call a false dichotomy, but I'd like your take on it. So a question about running openly as a socialist. It seems on one hand, there's a drive for candidates and politicians to normalize the word socialist by using it as often as possible. And we see how in Bernie Sanders' 2016 election, he greatly reduced the stigma of using that kind of word, but also has the potential effect of neutralizing words like that or making it synonymous with welfare or social democracy. And then on the other hand, there's the idea that we should completely avoid scary words like that and focus only on ideas. So what is your take on that perceived dichotomy? And do you think there's any other better options?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the fact that the word had been being used to mean so many different things, and almost none of them were worker ownership, and almost none of those people were actually talking about building working class power. And for me, there was a big part of like, I want to actually be using that word for what it means and be taking the opportunity of having the platform of being a US Senate candidate to actually be doing some broad public education about like, what the hell does this actually mean? And yes, it is sort of philosophically aligned with like the government doing more for people. I mean, that part of it, that association makes some sense to me, but that's not actually what the word means. And, I think there were two other factors for me with running in Wyoming in particular. I mean, one of them was that everybody gets labeled a socialist if you don't like them. And so it was like, I was going to get that label no matter what I did, just showing up with a D next to my name. And so it was like, why not actually go, yup, and kind of take the sting out of it and do a little bit of like, sort of like turning it around and going like, yes, and let's actually talk about what that really means. And I think the third factor for me is that I just suck at lying. And so I wasn't going to do a very good job of like avoiding the word that I actually feel like is a really accurate description of who I am and my politics and my orientation. And so, when you add all of that up, it was kind of a no-brainer for me to just go like, yeah, let's just use the word, but let's like use it for real.
Excellent.
I don't know like how that landed for you, like having me use that word so openly.
Yeah, Donatella, what did you think about that?
Well, from like a graphic design perspective, it was fascinating because it was like the marketer part of like the campaign. And so like coupling the very blatant and open, like, we're socialists, we're here to make that change, and then coupling it with like also, like being very open about the different policies that we were trying to do, I think kind of also took the sting out of it, because even when we were getting incredibly negative comments on our posts, they weren't anything of like value or content, even like in like the insults. And so I think there was something about we had taken out the sting of that and then caused to have just like a deflating of like those comments.
I'd kind of like to ask you an interesting question, since you were doing marketing and graphic design. Wyoming has a very Western cowboy ethos. Anybody who wants to can get the bucking bronco design. And how did you feel? How did you approach maybe perhaps the campaign narrative from socialism and wedding that with this Wyoming, independent spirit kind of thing? What did you find was a challenge, or did you find something that worked for you in bringing those two disparate elements together as a marketer and a graphic designer?
What was really fascinating about that too is that I'm actually like, as my like main profession, I'm a 3D artist, and then I'm a stage technician. So like the idea of like combining those to then do a 2D marketing campaign. I think for Wyoming, what's really fascinating is that we're really, on like a graphic design skill, really interested in like those new poppy things that like, regions like Colorado does, but want it to be toned down. So it was interesting to kind of try to balance between like my very abstract conceptual stuff to kind of put it more down to earth, straight to the facts. Let's make this like brief, and if they want to find out more. So my ended up being a lot of like text heavy, like very like snappy, like these are our statements, which I think would have been much different if we were even in a different state or region. So I thought that was really interesting. And then the other thing is I kind of steered away from anything super stereotypically Wyoming, which I don't know if it was beneficial or detrimental to our campaign, but it certainly, there's one where I did like a quilt, which ended up going semi-viral. And that one was like a little bit of that homey, like quilted feeling of like community, but also was very poppy of like, these are the people that we want to support. And so it was interesting to kind of see what was going, like what was catching a lot of attention and what was kind of like falling on the wayside. And a lot of it was just, whether or not it looked like it was from Wyoming.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if I'm understanding, I just want to follow up real quick. You said you used a lot of text. So you're telling me that people in Wyoming preferred to get their information in print format. That was very useful for them, which is interesting given the 21st century meme universe we seem to find ourselves stuck in.
And it's like, yeah, it's like one of those things where it just doesn't seem like it's transposable as much, because okay. I know that for Grayble's memes, for the most part, popped off, but it was still those text heavy memes versus like a very like image heavy AOC's graphic design like campaign that I don't think would have like meshed as well in Wyoming.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right, wouldn't have flown in Wyoming. Yana, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I think it was also interesting that like we steered away from the cowboy thing and leaned into so the logo was an antelope rather than the cowboy. And I think for me, and that decision actually predated Donatelia coming onto the campaign. So you sort of inherited that part of it. But I think that choice originally graphically was really about like wanting to invoke something that was a little more about the wilds and a little more about like sort of, I was a climate candidate. And so, not leaning into the like, hyper independence thing that I think is sort of promoting all of the problems that are leading to climate disruption in the country, and like leaning a little more into like, we're actually going to like connect with and hold up an animal that is a herd animal and is not a like, individualistic kind of thing, but is also very iconically Western for the United States. So I think there was that choice, but that was when you inherited. You just got to deal with my fascination with antelope.
Which ended up working out really great as a logo. I'm not gonna lie.
Beautiful, awesome.
I found the antelope a good selection because as conservative as Wyoming is, we love our minerals. Can't get without them. Got to have our coal. Got to have that oil. Got to make California sell it. But the other part of Wyoming, even in this really conservative state, has a strong sense of conservation. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of hunters, fishers, outdoor enthusiasts in Wyoming that want to see things like migration routes for antelope preserved, new interstate designs and highway designs so that we're not taking out our antelope with cars. And so I see how that would definitely mesh very well with a Wyoming ethos and get you away from that whole cowboy up ethos and lean back to a conservatism there. So once again, Derek, sorry, I find myself monopolizing the question and answer phase. So I'm just going to keep coming back to you, and unless Yana and Donatella have something they'd like to add more.
Yeah, thank you. I'm having a question about some primal decisions you would have had to make as you were beginning your campaign. And one was about, what was the process like of learning how much money would need to be involved in a campaign for a federal seat? And how did you make decisions considering how that money would come about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I was advised by somebody that you need at least $1 million to win a federal seat in Wyoming, which is a very small number for a federal race in almost any other state. It is a lot more than what we ended up raising, and a lot more than what my main opponent in the primary ended up raising as well. I think that her campaign ended up raising like close to $80,000, and I think we were at about like 46 or something. So there was all of that. It was kind of like what I was told I was going to need to win. And, you have to remember that when I made the decision to run, the strongest speculation was that Liz Cheney was going to run for this seat, and which didn't end up happening. It ended up being Cynthia Lummis instead. But it was like, the Cheneys have so much money that there was pretty much no way that we were going to be able to compete on a dollar basis. And I think we would have done a lot better if we had raised 3 to 5 times as much money as we did. I mean, we certainly would have ended up with more votes and been able to do a lot more of the stuff that I think Marav had a little bit of an advantage for, with being able to do like the auto texting stuff and, just a whole bunch of stuff that our campaign couldn't afford to do. And so, so I think for me, it was always like, we knew that this was a long shot to actually have me end up in DC. And we leaned into not hiring big outside names. I mean, every other major campaign in this race hired people from DC to come in, and from like the Biden campaign, and, and was sort of, leaning into the standard Democratic Party machinery. And I'm really proud to say that everybody who worked on this campaign are from Wyoming, live in Wyoming, have been here for a long time for the most part, except for Glenn, who's a graduate student at the university. But it's like, he didn't come here to work on a political campaign. He came here because of, great Wyoming public education opportunities. And so, so we just ended up having to have things be much more grassroots and, much more homegrown. And I actually feel like that was a better match for our campaign anyway. And yeah, I would have loved to have had $1 million to work with on this campaign. That would have been great.
My question on that point of everybody's here from Wyoming, I just want to share a brief experience that will then illuminate the question I'm going to ask. When I first moved to Wyoming some 15 years ago, it was an election year, and I was told by one of my classmates who was from Wyoming that I shouldn't be allowed to vote because I wasn't from Wyoming, and you liberals are coming here and you're changing, the way things work. So you weren't born in Wyoming, which apparently is a prerequisite to be from Wyoming, which I find to be a load of, BS. Matt Stannard is a 21-year resident. I would call him from Wyoming, and yet I still remember him commenting about, on the school board that Matt Stannard's not from here and he wants to bring all these crazy things. And I'm like, not from here. He's lived here 21 years. What are you talking? How long? So did you find yourself running into that? Well, how could you know anything about Wyoming if you're only been here for 5 years at the time when you decided to run?
I mean, yeah, everybody gets that. And the thing is, though, that like half of the adults who live in this state, half of the voters were not born in Wyoming. So it's like there was that thing of like, okay, so do all of those people who have chosen to come here not deserve representation? Is that actually what's kind of embedded in that? And I really think, I think it's fascinating that, so one of the reasons why I was glad that Dee was available to do this is that like, she actually is from here. And so I'd love to get your take on this particular question, but it's like, yes, and everybody gets that. And I kept getting the go back to California. And it's like, who the hell wants to live in California? Like, really? Like, so it was interesting to me as like a Midwesterner and somebody who is very much a product of rural America. Like, I feel like I actually grew up in spaces very like Wyoming in some significant ways. And then we had somebody, who was also running as a Democrat for the US House seat, who like literally had never been to Wyoming when she started her campaign, because that's not actually a legal requirement. And I find that really disturbing and frustrating. But Dee, what do you think of all that stuff being from around here?
Like, to even like, and I would do this in comments too, I'm a fourth generation Wyomingite. My great grandmother came here and colonized. Like, there was a farm on Crowheart, so first off, we all live on native land. This isn't like, we were here for generations and generations, especially the people who have like the big farms and ranchers, who often are the most upset about the idea that like people from California are coming in. And what's really fascinating about that is that we would have that kind of conversation, like all of you young folk are coming here from California, or all you liberals, but the other side of that is, I've heard my entire life that one of the biggest exports in Wyoming is our young people, because we don't stay, because even as we like go to college here and get told that we should go to college here because it's all paid for, we, as soon as we're out, we still get pushed out because we then aren't seen as Wyoming people, because we like the idea, like most Wyomingites like the idea of like conservativeness and like cowboying up, so much so that we are expelling and exiling like our younger, more liberal and progressive people. Like, I've seen it. And I've heard multiple people, and I would love to have some statistics on it, of the idea that like people like me leave Wyoming because we can't stay here because we're told that we don't belong and we don't exist here. And I remember a very interesting story. So I did go to UW and I got my BFA, and I was in sculpture, and I had to like play a part for a board of trustee member. And I remember very clearly him having a conversation with me about the fact that he thought my art was cool, but because it wasn't cowboys and Indians, which by the way is overtly racist, bronze statuettes, it didn't matter. And it wasn't very Wyoming, even though I've grown up here. I haven't really left here. I was born in Laramie. I lived in Cheyenne. And yet the art that I was making wasn't seen as Wyomingite and Wyoming. And so I think a lot of that like conversation about like, well, you don't live here, is a really just like looking at like this ideal of what like radical conservative Wyoming people like see and want to aspire to. And you see it propagate through our graphics, through our art, through what is like promoted and like granted like money and what is not granted money, especially like artistically. And so I think that's something that we had to like grapple with a lot. And me as like an artist and a queer artist, it was also something to grapple a lot with, trying to get a socialist to get, a federal seat in a state where normally would exile me and like tell me that I'm from California, even though like I am from here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that was a big part of like the most compelling conversations that I had with people when I was out and about, having, before we stopped being able to be out and about, but with people, was how much there were people in the state who have been here their whole lives or for many years, like, like Antifa, like you were saying, like Jason, Matt's been here for 21 years, and it's like he is a product of Wyoming in some significant ways at this point. And how many people felt seen and acknowledged by our campaign, because I was talking directly to young people and directly to progressives and socialists and directly to folks with disabilities who are often like really, really ignored in Wyoming politics, and queer folks who are like really ignored and even vilified in Wyoming politics. And that a lot of my goal was like, making it clear to all of those folks that, hey, you have a right to take up space in Wyoming politics. And I'm going to plant that flag and hope that then other people feel empowered by that and feel like they're able to plant similar flags in the future. I mean, we talked a lot about this idea of like opening up, the Overton window of like, what is okay to talk about in Wyoming politics? And to me, there was the content of that, but then there was also the process of that which is who is allowed to talk in Wyoming politics. And I sort of made the commitment that if I was going to run, I was going to be as open about who I am, and I was going to be as fierce about claiming space for all of those different populations in the state that I think have traditionally been like really marginalized. So that was a big part of it. And that quilt graphic that Dee was talking about, that was what that was about, is like, ending that sort of silencing of people in the state. And that was the graphic that we put out that I think, got the most traction, both on like left Twitter. There was a lot of action with it, and also, within Wyoming. And that was really encouraging to me.
Sorry, which graphic was that? The antelope?
No, it was go ahead.
So it was like acknowledging the different types of people who still vote in Wyoming and live in Wyoming. And so it was like, it had different colored quilt like shapes, and then it had like, I forgot what the hashtags were like, but
End the erasure was the hashtag for it. Yeah.
So end the erasure of like Black voters in Wyoming, of Native and Indigenous voters in Wyoming, of people with disabilities, and like things like that. And so each one had their own quilt because it's a part of our community. I mean, this has also been like a large topic that I've been kind of like circling around, is like the idea that, these people don't usually are seen as like part of our Wyoming political like scape, but they're prominent forever. Like we have a large disability population, we have a large Indigenous population, we have a large, very like in the like Wyoming roots Black population that people just conveniently forget about, even though there've been people who have generations here. And so I think there was a lot of like that graphic, and that's the one that went semi-viral on Twitter. And that was the one that was kind of still kind of having that conversation of like, who are we suppressing when we have these Wyoming political conversations? And like me personally is also one of those things that even though I'm white from Wyoming, I didn't necessarily feel like, because I didn't fit into the conservative Christian like stereotype, that I couldn't like talk about or run for office in a way that I helped Yana run her campaign.
This is all very fascinating, and I just want to remind everybody that you are listening to Solidarity House Collective, and join us on patreon.com. Donatella, actually, I want to focus in on something you said and affirm your idea that, this isn't Wyoming art, so we don't care. I seem to recall, you've been to Laramie, obviously, you know everything Laramie, and they were putting a new sculpture out in front of the courthouse. They had the deer jumping out in the 4 different directions, and then remember that. But then on the north side, there was for people to submit ideas, and one artist abstract, but not really. It was quite literal, and there was a letter to the editor fiercely advocating that this is not Wyoming art. And if you've seen that sculpture, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. It's the one that literally shows how windy it is in Laramie. I mean, it's the tree with the birdhouse, with everything, just like, holy crap, this is windy, and looking at that, it just reminded me of what you were saying. So I wanted to affirm that you're not the only one that's suffering from that, kind of analysis, but also that was uniquely Wyoming in my estimation. I mean, I live out here on the prairie where it's 85-mile-an-hour winds, not all that infrequently. So I just wanted to affirm that. And have you seen that sculpture? And if so, what do you think about it? Is it not the epitome of wind in Wyoming and Laramie?
This is like this is a big thing for me, because I actually took a public arts class, and we talked about it, and I actually met the artist who made that sculpture, and we had like a very long conversation about it in my class. And you know, one of the things is that he's from Laramie. He's a longtime local artist. He did the proposal. Everyone thought it was great. And like the idea of like this editor thinking that this wasn't Wyoming just because it was poppy colors and a little bit abstract was ridiculous, because he did. And we went and we like actually went and talked to him with the sculpture like in front of us. And like the things was like the trucking industry that is huge in Wyoming is a part of that. The history of like historical like women with the shoes, and like how like this community was built on people of all variety of walks of life, and specifically women. And so that's where the heels come from in this like building, and then like the different houses of like the homesteaders, and like this sculpture encapsulated like what Wyoming is in like a contemporary context. And I found it incredibly frustrating that that kind of dialogue was so badly taken as an editorial, and then like taken as like not Wyoming art. And I think it just kind of shows that we are stuck in this weird literal representational bronze statue that is kind of part of the course for like American art in general, but specifically people who really kept and stuck to the idea of manifest destiny and representational art as like the one way to describe like specifically like Western thought through art. And so it's a reaffirming that essentially, yeah, that, you know, even though this is very much a Wyoming piece of art from a local artist who spent his entire career sculpting stuff for Wyoming, that it wasn't seen as it because it didn't have a cowboy hat on it. And I think that's a real disappointment for Wyoming as a whole through our art, because we could do so much better with the kind of work that we have.
And I think the thing that ties a whole bunch of this stuff together for me is that, so there is this need to hang on to power and hang on to a sort of like normative perception of what Wyoming is supposed to be all about. And it ties together the arts and politics and our economic system and a whole bunch of other stuff. And to me, it's like, this is like white supremacy and patriarchy and the fossil fuel industry desperately clinging to Wyoming is one dimensional, because that one dimension has served keeping power locked in for a certain group of people. And those people are very good at running people out of the state. Like young people, the way that Dee has been talking about. I mean, I'm going to be leaving soon. Carl Beach is talking about leaving. I mean, a whole bunch of people who were willing to show up and really be in service in this state are ending up leaving because there's this one dimensionality that can be really hard to break through. And I sort of knew that when I decided that I was going to run, was that I'm going to be talking about stuff that like you're not supposed to talk about. And that part of the point was to start breaking up the fabric of that not allowed to talk about it thing. But I just see all of this as being like, like culturally and economically, the power base in this state needs to hang on to this one dimensionality of Wyoming. And it's so completely not true. Like when you're actually out there talking to people, like the state is so rich, like culturally and spiritually and socially. And, and so we made our attempt to do like a little, just like a 14-month blitz of like, this is not all there is to Wyoming. And I feel really good about that part of it. Yeah.
I want to steer it back to the campaign. You were running openly as a socialist. If I'm not mistaken, you did not receive the endorsement of the DSA, but that didn't stop you from being a socialist. Is that correct?
Well, I received the endorsement of our local DSA chapter. So the only DSA activity in Wyoming enthusiastically endorsed me. I did not get the national endorsement.
I see. And that's not really here or there, but I'm just talking about coalition building. Did you find yourself working with other candidates to get your name, their name, and a common agenda out there in Wyoming? Did you find other fellow travelers that were also running for office in different areas and sectors that you felt could work with, and that you did work with during the campaign?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, I was the only one using the S word in an open way. But, both I did a number of events where I invited other candidates to come and to be in dialogue with me. And both Carl Beach and Lynette Grable were willing to show up for that. Jackie Grimes was, one of the people who showed up for that conversation. And so I did feel like there was some real kinship. And Lynn Huskinson would be the other person that was actively running, who I felt that kind of like strong kinship with, and that we were sort of openly owning our connection with each other. And so I do feel like there were other pockets. And as far as I know, I was the only one who was willing to go to the level of saying, like, I am actually a socialist in a really open way. But I do feel like there is a lot of overlap. And one of the things that was really surprising and encouraging for me is that I took a very socialist agenda into the Democratic Party during the campaign. And so both at our county convention and then at the state convention, I got worker ownership into the state platform, and, public banks into the state platform. And so there was a way that I think, in a weird sort of way, like me just owning the word made it possible to at times have conversations where that word didn't need to be in there, and where we could have a more clean conversation about, like, hey, what about this policy? Like, let's actually talk about the content of what a more socialist economy would look like. And those proposals passed with flying colors at the state convention. And I don't think that means that, like, the Democrats are now socialists, but I do think that there's a way that there is a sensibility and a humanity to actual socialist policies that we were able to get some legs and get some actual movement on in the state. And so I'm hoping that those platform pieces don't get taken out, the next time that they do the platform revisions. But I do feel like I actually ended up with a very positive relationship with the formal leadership of the state Democratic Party, and in some ways the typically shitty relationship with a bunch of liberals in the state who, were, I think, afraid of what I was bringing and afraid of the fact that I was just so openly progressive. And so I think I'd give sort of like mixed review to the state party with this, but it wasn't because of the official state leadership. I mean, I think Joe Barbuto was really supportive, and and he couldn't endorse anybody, and I don't know if he would have endorsed me if it came down to it, but Joe was absolutely very supportive. And I think the same thing is true with the state. The state staff were terrific, and I never felt like there was any weirdness there. And so I do feel like there were some really good coalition moments. The Sunrise Movement for this part of the state also endorsed me, and I felt really supported by the youth climate activists in the state were incredibly supportive. So yes, and there were limits to how far people were willing to take it publicly.
In that vein, I had a question regarding, I guess, the state of the Democratic Party in Wyoming.
Mm-hmm.
In some of the debates that I saw you in, an impression I got was that the Democratic Party is kind of a catch-all for candidates who didn't feel like they'd be able to get ahead in the GOP hegemony in the state.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like there was an extremely wide variety of ideas that were being thrown around in the primary.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's just me fallaciously thinking that some of the small fringe candidates were being put on the same platform as, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
you and I guess the neoliberal candidates who have the most support from the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty accurate. I mean, I do think that, so the debate that had the most of us there was the public TV station did a debate that actually got all six of us on stage together, and that was the only time that all six of us were together. And yeah, so Ken Kasner and Rex Wild and Nathan and Marav and I, we're really different people and have really different politics. And, and Ken was even saying things like, I'm not even a Democrat, I'm really an independent. And like, I shouldn't even be running as a Democrat. And I was like, okay, whatever, Ken. And so I think there were ways that there were people who were much more conservative than the mainline Democratic Party. And then there was me who's, much more progressive and radical than the Democratic Party in general. And we were on the stage together. And I think there's something really positive about that, actually. And it's been interesting watching the two state parties and how they've sort of responded to divisiveness in politics. And I really see the Wyoming Republican Party as kind of imploding right now and sort of like eating itself. And I think the state Democratic Party has actually done a much better job of making the tent bigger instead of smaller and not sort of like cracking down on folks. And, I ended up getting a bunch of pressure, after Bernie had dropped out and it became apparent that Biden was going to be the nominee. I got a lot of pressure from mostly from other candidates to endorse Biden. And I was just like, I'm not going to do that. And, and had a conversation with folks in the state leadership of the party. And they were like, we don't need you to do that. Like, that's not coming from us. And I felt like that was really good leadership on their part. And so, I feel like there's a way that the state Democratic Party under the current leadership has the potential to actually become more of an umbrella group, and that is partly going to include having space for more leftists within the Democratic Party. And so my hope is that I'm not the last open leftist who really like, plants a flag and like works on pulling the party to the left. I mean, I think there are some really great people active in the state who think that electoral politics are relevant. That's not true of all leftists, but I think there are some folks in the state who do think that. And I think they're trying to decide what relationship they want to have with the state Democratic Party. And so I would just, encourage any of those folks listening to draw a distinction between what's coming from the leadership and what's coming from like basically scared neoliberal boomers who still have influence in the state. And I'm like, just fucking ignore those folks. Like they're not where the Democratic Party needs to be going. And like, don't give them more power by like going, I hate the Democrats. It's like, actually, I think the Democratic Party in the state has done a pretty good job in this last cycle of actually getting more expansive rather than contracting.
Can we ask Dee how the Democratic Party in the state is going and where it needs to go, particularly for young people who do want to stay here?
So as someone, so like I think this last cycle, one of the things is that 100% we agree. Over the years, the Democratic Party has been the catch-all for like anything that wasn't a very tight-knit part of the conservative Wyoming ideal, which is why there was a whole imploding of like calling Liz Cheney a rhino after that whole stuff. But there was some conscious shift that happened because I started going to Democratic Party meetings at the Laramie County Democratic Party fairly consistently, and there was a definite shift of like trying to be more inclusive and like adding to like trying to use that like, well, we have this umbrella, let's actually like use it to our advantage and try to expand as much as possible. And I think there has been like a more conscious shift, especially with some of the leadership throughout different counties that are very much pushing for a more progressive or at least more inclusive dialogue, because they can't figure out how they weren't able to do anything else. Like traditional kind of like corporate Democratic Party doesn't really fit in Wyoming because none of us really have money for that. And so we still have that there, but there was more of like that push for like being that more inclusive, like what can we do with our catch-all to make it more where we can like either grow or like actually get more like blue seats in office in Wyoming. So I think that's like, not to like go off on a little bit of a tangent, but I have seen a little bit more of that that like shift, and definitely a little bit more push of like trying to get more young people to either stay or at least be involved in politics, where usually we're pretty quickly pushed out of like any kind of dialogue.
And I think the missing piece that is still missing, and I was the only one who was doing this really, is talking about working class power. I mean, what the Democrats still lack is a power analysis that at all reflects reality in terms of everyday circumstances that people are living with on the ground. And so that would be the piece, like, so I'm encouraging people to like not give up on the Democratic Party in the state, but I also want to encourage the Democratic Party to not give up on people. And I think that without some kind of real power analysis, and it was so obvious a couple times in the debates that, like, you know, I was pushing a power analysis and like everybody else was kind of like, I have my pet thing that I'm going to talk about at every debate. And I'm like, what's your analysis of like why we are where we're at? And that is monumentally missing, I think, from the Democratic Party still in the state and at the federal level. I think it's missing. And so, you know, you've got people like Bernie and AOC and Rashida Tlaib, who is my favorite of the whole bunch, and Cori Bush, who is quickly becoming another one of my favorites. And, you know, these are people who are talking about power. And if you look at that, I mean, other than Bernie, it's almost all women of color who are doing that. And, you know, Wyoming's not going to be able to wait for women of color to save us. I mean, you know, bless Lynette Grable, and like, I hope she stays in politics, and I think she's fabulous. And like, we're like, white working class people in Wyoming are going to have to like get their shit together and actually start talking about power analysis in our politics if we are going to actually have the kind of shift that we really need in this state. And I think that would keep young people in the state a lot more if they actually heard that coming out of politicians' mouths more. And I think it would certainly keep, you know, queer folks from, you know, feeling like they don't have anywhere to go. And my hope is that it's going to be done in a multiracial organizing way, you know, so that it is also a place where are Indigenous and Latinx and Black, and, you know, actually there's a big like Thai population in the state as well. And, you know, so there's a whole bunch of people that I think need us to be talking about power.
Wow. Thank you so much for that. We're down to about 15 minutes left this morning, and I want to get a little local. Last year was crazy. John Oliver literally blew it up in his last week tonight episode. And we had a pandemic. We also had massive nationwide protests against racial injustice, even here in Laramie. Talk about, and then there's this thing in Albany County, which Laramie is located, with the sheriff and a sheriff's deputy that, you know, I don't want to get into all the details, but, you know, there was an inappropriate use of force and somebody was murdered by being shot in the back. And yeah, and he's still on the sheriff's, you know, staffs, but that's not the point. So as a socialist, as a Democrat, as a candidate, how did this environment impact your ability to campaign, and what did you do during that summer of, I don't know what to call it, catastrophe, because it was just one massive thing after another. And so how does one do that? You know, how do you campaign in that kind of a situation? And what was your response as a campaign? I think I have an idea, to both of those disasters, that intersection of the health crisis and the racial injustice in our country.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I had been one of the founding members of ACOP, which was the organization that started in the aftermath of Robbie Ramirez's murder at the hands of Derek Calling. And so that was actually in some ways like my first real foray into organizing work. I mean, I had done a couple things here and there, but that was really the first time that it was like, there's a campaign here that I'm going to throw myself into. And so, and I ended up getting out of that in order to make space in my life to be, you know, running for office. And so I was very excited to see the, you know, the protests happening in Laramie, and really impressed and I guess inspired by the leadership of like young people of color in town, like getting out there in the streets, and that there were so many people who, you know, showed up at least some for those protests, and a bunch of us who showed up, really consistently for those, including, a couple folks from here, who are part of Solidarity Collective, who were like in the streets almost every day. And I was not able to do that, but I was in the streets, and I was, willing to, say on the campaign trail, hey, I'm in the streets. Where are you? Like, where are you on these topics? Because I know where I am, and that is with the people protesting against police violence and militarized violence, period, in the United States. And here's our local example of it, and like, here's these global examples of it. And so, I was talking anti-militarization on the campaign trail, which was the one of the appropriate levels. I mean, most policing stuff is not regulated at the federal level. We just saw the House pass a bill that looks like it's headed in the right directions, but a lot of those regulations aren't actually federal business, they're local business. And so the parts of it that I was sort of taking and applying to what I was doing was talking about, we live in a culture that solves problems with violence. And that's true with the police. It's true with domestic violence. It's true with suicide, which we have a horrible problem with in Wyoming. And so one of my approaches to that topic on the campaign trail was connecting those dots between like the cultural frameworks and the economic frameworks that pin in police violence and pin in the United States being like the world's bully, basically, and talking about that stuff in like really frank terms. And I know that was impactful. I actually had a couple people who, switched from being registered as Republicans to Democrats to vote for me, because I was the only one who was really talking in serious terms, not just bitching, but also saying like, and here's the policies that we could be doing differently, and actually like making it, not just protest, which I think some people are like, yeah, you're just in the streets yelling and you're not really proposing anything. And I'm like, okay, here's what I'm proposing. And I know that was impactful on, some people in terms of their voting decisions. And in terms of COVID, I was the only candidate who was talking about Medicare for all from day one. And we watched some of the other candidates kind of dance around it and not quite know what to do with that. And watched other people like move to the left over the course of COVID. And I don't think that would have happened had the pandemic not hit. I don't think like, me just being, the radical way far left would have pulled people as much as I think that pulling happened because I had planted a flag. And there was then this really compelling and horrifying thing that was happening around us where it was like, oh yeah, actually more people are getting it, that we'd be in a really different place nationally if we had had Medicare for all at the beginning. And so I think those circumstances, it was also good because I didn't have to drive all over the state for the second half of the campaign. And I do pretty good online with, communications. And that was not true for some of the other candidates. So I think like in a warped sort of way, I think it actually helped me in the campaign to do better because I was more flexible with how I can communicate. Yeah, I mean, there was a bunch more to it, but I think those are sort of the highlights of what I did with those two things.
Well, I just got to say for this entire interview, mind blown. Derek, back to you. Any follow-up questions as we head into the last few minutes of our interview? I'd love to go on forever. I'd love to have a conversation about art with you, Donatella, and so we're probably going to have to follow up. Amazing. So I would love to talk to you about that. But Derek, microphone back to you, sir.
Yeah, a question that we might have time to fully cover before we have to wrap up. What was a bigger challenge, do you think, in your campaign between being ignored versus being attacked in a political sense?
Oh, that's interesting. Publicly, I don't know that either one of those were actually that big. I mean, I think that there was some behind the scenes undermining that was happening that was probably more frustrating than anything else. Honestly, I think that my partner took the brunt of the attacks a little bit more than I did. And I think that goes back to that kind of one dimensionality, and there's this conceptualization about like masculinity and like having your wife be the one who's running for office. And so I think Matt got hit really hard a few times with some pretty nasty attacks. And I have the kind of personality where things roll off me a little bit, where I'm like, okay, whatever, I'm just going to like keep doing my thing over here. Um, I was impressed with a few of the press outlets in the state where I feel like we saw a shift in how socialism was being talked about over the course of the campaign. It was actually interesting because at one point I was in the studio in Rock Springs getting interviewed by a couple folks in the press. And I actually kind of like turned the tables on them for a minute and was like, what are you seeing in terms of how this word is being talked about? And they were like, no, we definitely think it's being talked about differently now than it was 8 months ago when you started this. And so I think the press started out having me be kind of an additional mention in their articles. And I was like the Laramie Socialist. And that was sort of all that was said about me in articles at the beginning. And by the end, I feel like there was a lot more interest in like, okay, what is this public banking thing? And, and I think that people got in the press got more comfortable actually, talking about some of the stuff that I was talking about. And yeah, and so I don't know that it was actually either one of those that hit me so much as I was seeing it hit people that I really love. And that part was really hard.
Dee, how did you feel about the way the campaign was perceived? Did you ever feel like it was too radical, or not obviously too radical for you, but did people ask, wow, your candidate saying the S word, what's going on with that?
I think it's interesting because I think had I started this campaign maybe when I was in high school, I would have gotten a lot more backlash just because of the circles that I ended up being in. And I was actually homeschooled for 18 years of my life. And so like I think there was probably a lot of backlash in like those circles. But as far as like the circles that I was like talking to and trying to get through, I think they've been so tired of getting like poverty wages, and like the people who, I end up encircling with are people who are like working in warehouses or in like jobs that just don't have. So I think the idea of socialism is way more appealing to them because capitalism has been doing them so wrong for so long. And so I think there's like that. For me, it was on a personal scale, that's where it was. And on a graphical scale, like trying to get and keep the algorithm pointed towards more of the people who were like on the fence. And it would be difficult if we had enough people say really horrible things, then more of those people would show up. And so trying to like balance, like, how do we get more of those people who are on the middle of the road versus the people who are just, trolling because they had nothing else to do, was a little bit of like a difficulty, like graphically, like through the algorithm, and trying to kind of like keep steering it more leftist, or even just like in groups of people who are not usually political, and trying to get their feeds to get our stuff. And I think that was a really interesting, like, way to try to like, what kind of graphics can we do? What kind of information do we put out consciously to make sure that we're getting to the people who actually are going to vote for us and be more comfortable with socialism once they know that like workers' rights is attached to socialism. And I think that was kind of like trying to get that was, I think, a challenge. But a good challenge is trying to like figure out how to continue to contribute to like the graphical side of that. And then personally, I think people who are in my circles were very excited. People in like my age group and a little bit older and a little bit younger are very, very tired of living here in a state that doesn't listen or validate any kind of experience other than a rich cowboy.
I guess I want to throw in one more question, or make sure that we have time to talk about this. A lot of socialists don't think that we should run for office because the entire electoral system is a reflection of deep capitalist hierarchy and injustice. We're validating things. We should be building revolution and doing direct action and mutual aid and all of those other things. And then there are folks who are very electoralist, including a lot of, sort of, you might call the right flank of DSA, that is very much about let's make an electoral system where the squad is the, new face of the Democratic Party, and let's really concentrate on elections. How did you, Yana, handle that dichotomy?
I think everybody's right. I mean, I think that there are ways that the electoral system is incredibly problematic, um, and it would be certainly less problematic if the squad was like the center of the Democratic Party instead of the far left of the Democratic Party, where I think most of them are not even that radical. So I think that the criticisms of electoralism are spot on and they make sense to me. And it made sense for me to run partly because the Overton window in Wyoming has been so narrow and that it wasn't going to take superpowers to like open that window up by just like showing up. And so that felt worth it. But I mean, my encouragement to people is like, find the niche that you are comfortable in and like fully go for it. I mean, I have like a revolutionary heart in many ways. And so I also feel really connected to that part of the left. And I think that we don't know which one of those is ultimately going to make the bigger impact. And so I'm like, find your niche and the place that you're comfortable and the place that makes sense to your brain and makes sense to your skill sets and lean fully into that. But like, let's not beat the hell out of each other for making different choices about that. You know, I mean, I've had one foot in each of those worlds now. And I think that there is a lot of merit in both of them. And I don't think we get to know who's right about that until 300 years from now when we're all dead. And so, you know, I'm interested in continuing to pursue both of these kinds of fronts in terms of my own activism. And I feel like I have deep and sincere comrades in like sort of one foot in each of those worlds, I guess.
The almost 5,000 people in Wyoming voted for Yana, and those people, due to your efforts and Yana's efforts and others, could not have not known, had to have known what they were voting for, had to have known that they were voting for a pretty far left candidate. What, that's a lot of votes. Why do you, how would you explain that so many people voted for Yana?
I think it's like a variety of things, like a large things, especially during like the fact that we had COVID and then the Black Lives Matter protests. And I think there is a lot to say about the idea that in this election cycle, and we can see this through a lot of the other races, especially in our country, is that people had the time to actually like take some time to be like, okay, so why is this happening? Because we were stuck at home. And I think that was also a big thing. But I also think in general for, you know, the 5,000 votes, you know, it looked like and it felt like, and I think it was something that like a beacon of hope that normally wouldn't be. I mean, usually it's the conversation as well. I'm registered as R, so I have more choices. I'm registered as R because, you know, nothing really counts. And I think the more like the very upfront, like I want to help you and your family and your community through, you know, the acts of the fact that, you know, there was acknowledgement that coal miners were going to lose their jobs, and CEOs were just bankrupting so that they can cash out on their businesses, you know, and there was like that push of acknowledgement, like, yeah, that's going to happen, but here's why I'm trying to help you anyway, even though, you know, I want more renewable energy. And I think that frankness caused a lot of people to be like, okay, I think, you know, as a Wyoming, in my values, I think a good, solid, like straightforward honesty is a moral that Wyoming people have. And I think Yana really encapsulated that in a way that gave people to be like, okay, she's not, you know, she wants to give me a better life than I'm experiencing right now, which is watching bankruptcy and rural poverty and poverty wages.
Eric, did you have any other questions?
I think that wraps up everything that we could go over this morning. Really appreciated the opportunity to ask all these questions, though. That was a lot of enlightenment.
Cool.
Yeah, it was very great to have you. What else, I mean, what else do you have to say to take us out?
Well, I just want to say that so when I put out on we still have a team chat that we still like send each other memes and like talk shit on and stuff. And so I put out the like, hey, who wants to come on the podcast with me? And almost everybody on the team was like, oh, me, oh, me. And so I think that we're going to record a full team conversation for Solidarity House at some point in the next
Awesome.
weeks. And so if y'all want to submit questions for that, for the team, that would actually be super fun. And we would welcome that. And I'll probably just grab one of my fellow Solidarity House folks to kind of moderate that conversation for us. But we're excited to like talk more about it and to be sort of forward looking. And it's interesting to me having this conversation now where it was like really exactly 2 years ago that I was in the process of making this decision to run. And so we're sort of at that point in the cycle where there could be people in Wyoming going like, oh, should I do this? And so I want these conversations to be ones that might get other people to put their hands in the air and plant some of those same flags. So that's what I'm hoping.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, everybody. Definitely looking forward to that second discussion with the entire team. But thanks, Dee, and thanks, Yana. And this is the Solidarity House live stream. Remember to support us at patreon.com/solidarityhouse. And we will see you all. We will catch you all on the proverbial flip side. Solidarity, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.